I know that you have read already Thinking in Time in the appropriate chapter on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I know that in terms of the decision-making process, that Allison and Zeliko's work, at least a chapter of that is in your hands, that essence of decision. So I'll assume that that is background. Also, whenever you do have time, I'm not in the movie business, and I'm not recommending every feature of this movie, but 13 Days with Kevin Costner is a good movie to take a look at once you are deeply into the Cuban Missile Crisis and its analysis. There are lots of errors in it, including the fact that Kenny O'Donnell, played by Kevin Costner, really didn't have the role that he's portrayed to have within the movie, but that's okay. There are other inaccuracies in it, but it really does give you the feel for the great drama and the crisis that this young president had to go through. So with that as background, I'll come back to a few other things like that as we move through. And now you see on the screen the conceptual framework that we use in NISL. And it, of course, has context, it has vision, it has strategy, and it has decisions and actions. So what I want to do now is work our way through each of those. So let's start with context. The context is never over. I want to stress that. You don't do an analysis of the context and then you never return to it. That would be silly. As a matter of fact, sometimes when I read in the paper, oh, the strategy was wrong in this or that, I say, well, wait a minute, the strategy was wrong. That's not the issue. The issue is the contextual analysis was wrong. If the analysis is wrong, it doesn't really matter what you've got for a vision or strategy or what decisions and so forth. You can't really get it right except by accident. So you've got to continue to go back to the context to make sure that the vision and the strategies and the decisions and actions actually match up. So what's the big context here for the Cuban Missile Crisis? And again, I assume that you've read the basic case within Neustadt and May, Thinking in Time. Well, way back there from the 19th century, see, it doesn't really start on October the 16th or October the 4th or September the 4th of 1962. It really starts with the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century, in which the young nation essentially told Europeans to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, that this was not a playground for European powers in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. So that was a doctrine that we have had politically a long, long time. It is sometimes said that Americans don't have long-term strategies. Well, there's one, the Monroe Doctrine. The Cold War brought us also a 50-year strategy of deterrence and mutual assured destruction. There's one also. So we have to not just dismiss American steadfastness. We do have steadfastness. The Monroe Doctrine is one of those. Then there's the Rio Pact of 1947, after World War II, in which we, together with the Latin countries, made a pact not to introduce socialist and communist systems within the Organization of American States and so forth. Then there's the general background of the Cold War, 1947 and following, after World War II and the dust settling and those destroyed nations and what was really happening from that point on. Well, there was the introduction, of course, of nuclear atomic weapons and then nuclear weapons. And then it was the fact of the two superpowers. And then we move forward to concepts of mutual assured destruction and deterrence and all of that held over the next 50 years. So the Cuban Missile Crisis actually sits in a lot of historical context at that point. Some of it political, some of it deeply cultural, about the nature of the governance, the nature of the nation states within that part of the world. Anyway, 8:45 in the morning of the 16th of October, the then National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, goes to the apartment of the president, knocks on the door to tell the president that the day before, on the 15th of October, one of our U-2 planes flying over Cuba did find missiles and did find warheads. The belief at that time was that they were not mated. So the young president is faced on the morning of the 16th of October with a set of facts that directly were contradicted by him to the American people in a speech the president gave on the 4th of September, just 6 weeks before that. During the summer, Senator Keating and a few others, Senator Keating from New York, had really been putting the pressure on the young administration because there were rumors that the Soviet Union was up to this. And there was a call into the Soviet Union to Gromyko himself and to Dobrynin and to others who all denied, and denied directly to the president, that there was underway the introduction of nuclear weapons into Cuba or into the Western Hemisphere. So he was shocked, really, by this, that they had such a bold-faced lie less than 6 weeks before. So it goes back to that, and then why was that? Why would the Soviet Union boldly lie to a president on the 4th of September? And obviously they knew that at some point we would find out, and here we did some 6 weeks later. Well, there's a little history to that as well. Remember that the young president came in through the election of 1960 and came into office in January of 1961. Well, in April of 1961, you had the Bay of Pigs, which was an invasion by Cuban exiles, about 1,300 of them, of the island of Cuba. Well, this was left over from plans at the very end of the Eisenhower administration, and the Kennedy administration really didn't deeply support it, but let it go forward. The result of that were 90 killed and the rest were captured, subsequently let go through some negotiations. So after the Bay of Pigs, we had the encounter between Khrushchev and the young president in June of 1961 at the Vienna summit. Thereafter, the Soviet Union, on the 13th of August 1961, began the construction of the Berlin Wall. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is part of a series of interactions and tensions that were building between the Soviet Union and the United States. I talk about this because there is a political and a political military and a national historical context that we really have to understand in order to come anywhere near understanding the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's all in the background. Another area that is important to look at is language. I can't stress enough how important language is, and you as leaders in your schools probably have a good feel for that. We used to say in the Pentagon, the one who got the paper on the table first had a heck of an advantage. So outlining what issues are, explaining the outline to those involved, the agendas for meetings, the reports of meetings, the standard operating procedures, all of those are extremely important. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, what language is used? Well, the Soviet Union, when you go back and look at their notes, clearly say they have introduced only defensive weapons. Well, from our viewpoint, that defense is an offense. You can say they're defensive if they were only second strike, but they look distinctly like offensive in that if they were used, they could eliminate 100 million in the coast of the United States. So you lost all of the time that was assured in mutual assured destruction. The Soviet Union at that time didn't have a lot of intercontinental ballistic missiles, so it was moving medium-range ballistic missiles closer to our shore. They also knew that we had medium-range ballistic missiles in places like Italy and in Turkey, so that was close to where they were. They also knew that we and the British and the French had each sectors of Berlin. Now Berlin was in the hinterland or inside East Germany. East Germany was a satellite of the Soviet Union. So you can think also when dealing with these negotiations of how parallelism is so very important. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Then analogies. All through the Cuban Missile Crisis, you find senior people in the executive committee, the ExComm, using analogies. They're saying, for instance, oh, this sounds to me like Pearl Harbor. And another one says, oh, this sounds like Pearl Harbor in reverse. And we have Bobby Kennedy saying, we can't do a sneak attack like Pearl Harbor. Americans have never done sneak attacks in all of our history. Then there's references to the Suez-Hungary issue. When the Suez Canal was closed, it was a distraction from not allowing the United States to help in the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. So there are these trade-offs and parallelisms that are in recent Russian interactions with the United States. The naming of things becomes important too. From the outset, we called it the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's not called that in Russian history books. It's called the Crisis in the Caribbean. Crisis in the Caribbean. There's one piece of language that I find very intriguing that comes from Bob Lovett, who was Secretary of Defense at one time. He says the following: good judgment is usually the result of experience, and experience is frequently the result of bad judgment. So there's a little bit of a learning curve we all have. Let me talk a little bit about organizational matters, because those will be important when we also talk about decision-making and decision-making mechanisms. The ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm. The president, soon after coming down, orders a meeting of selected members of the National Security Council. And they meet around noon, and they meet again late afternoon into the ExComm. And his brother, who was Attorney General, took over the chairmanship of the ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. That's all very, very important as we now talk about that organization and also the other organizations that are represented. Because when we come to decision-making a little bit later, what we have to understand is where people stand often depend on where they sit. So the Army has one viewpoint as a land force, and you might imagine invasion and occupation. The Air Force has one viewpoint, and you might think surgical bombing and take out the air defense. And the Navy has blockades and quarantines. So we see, even in some of the suggestions about courses of action, that often the organization brings with it its biases, its prejudices, and presents all of those, of course, as moments of truth. So the organizations themselves had their own interests. Then in the Soviet case, the Soviet military, compared to the premier, Nikita Khrushchev, who himself was on rocky steps and didn't last too much longer after the Cuban Missile Crisis. We also have the intelligence communities who are feeding information to those who are in the policy-making positions. Some of this may sound very interesting to many of you as you now deal with any of the contemporary events with the intelligence community, other organizations of the government. Okay, so who are the players? That's an important dimension too, and I'll come back to this as well when we do the decision-making. Because whom you choose to have on a committee and the direction you give them and the biases you understand that they have, all of that's very important. Some folks are engaged in major drama because of their positions, certainly Khrushchev, certainly Kennedy. But there's Castro, not much of a role. In fact, angry with the Soviet Union for a long time after the Cuban Missile Crisis or the crisis in the Caribbean because he felt that they just pulled out and left him with nothing. He was not really part of the decision-making that Khrushchev and the Soviet military really went through. The ExComm had a whole variety of folks, and noticed that 3 of members of the ExComm were Republicans, Robert Lovett, Douglas Dillon, and Dean Acheson. There was a time when bipartisanship like that on executive committees was a regular feature. And Douglas Dillon, of course, had been Secretary of Treasury for the Kennedy administration. Lots of administrations that followed, of course, including the Obama administration, do have Republicans, and Republicans have Democrats in it. Very important dimension of it, however, to bring back, quote, expertise in the case of Lovett, in the case of Dean Acheson. So you have a young president putting together an organization here led by his brother with lots of deep experience, and on it folks like Acheson who have been dealing with the Soviet Union for decades upon decades. So lots and lots of experience. Let's go back and talk a little bit about communication, though. Okay, so the 4th of September, the president comes on, tells the American people over television that we're monitoring this very carefully. The Soviets have assured us they're not introducing these kinds of offensive weapons into Cuba. He's very careful with the word nuclear. And yet, here we are. The president has to speak to the nation on the 22nd of October, 1961, to give them the fuller picture and to issue the ultimatum to the Soviet Union about what has to happen.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail.
You have to be very careful about what you tell people or don't tell people. The president judiciously waited until the night of the 22nd of October to tell the American people, who were absolutely incredibly resigned and had great confidence in the president and in the apparatus that was underway. It's 1962, had been through World War II, had been through the Korean War. Vietnam War was really not cranking up or in anybody's consciousness at that time. So this was a different war understanding. They also had been through atomic explosions at the end of World War II in the Asia context, and they also had lived through the early years of bomb shelters and of warnings and all the rest of that. So there was a population that, in some sense, was very strong and knew what tyranny looked like and was resigned to resist that. You also have time, and that's an important dimension here. Time. So it's now the 16th of October, and the president doesn't talk to the nation until the 22nd of October. Can you imagine in this early part of the 21st century having the luxury of that many days? The president also kept this out of the paper from the 16th of October to the 22nd of October. He had Pierre Salinger as a press secretary at the time, but even Pierre Salinger was not informed. It wasn't until probably around the 20th or 21st that there was even a hint of anything going on. And that's because of some of the movement and deployment of forces. There's another dimension of it. Can you imagine organizations being able to do the following? The Air Force and the Army moved probably 2/3 of the air power in the continental United States to Florida. The Army had over 400,000 troops in Florida, in preparation possibly for an invasion that would happen maybe late in October. This is incredible to have moved that much potential firepower to Florida over those days as we have the grinding out of the logistics and the standard operating procedures, all done in secrecy, something that could not be a feature of a major crisis today. So you have to factor into all of this a communications level that just wasn't there at that time. So some of those become very important to us. Time and place. Time. Well, 6 full days of deliberation. What should we do? The early on pieces of this become very important. We find another secretary saying, asking what to do drives out thought. Asking what to do drives out thought. I think you all as leaders need to be very careful about the 1-minute manager syndrome. Walking down the corridor of the school, what about this? What about that? Oh, I'm glad I spotted you. What about this? What about this? What about this? And we have the kind of stovepipes and chimneys and kinds of decisions made in isolation from the strategic level of thinking. So we have to be very careful. We have some time for deliberation in this case. I also underline that because there's one big, huge difference between your responsibilities if it's a 911 situation or a 411 situation. The 911, very important to have standard operating procedures, and you've just followed them. But where there is time for the deliberation, 411, information, getting the data, bringing it in, looking at it. Go get me some more data. Do I have enough data? Is this the right data? Do I have data that's false to deal with here? What else do I know? What do I not know? And the famous question out of the FBI report of 9/11, I don't know what I know. We could ask that question a lot of these crises. I don't know what I know because there hasn't been the communication, the collaboration. So even things I do know, I don't get to know at the right time and at the right level. So situations are full of surprise, always discovery as we go through. On the data question, yes, we go forward, but many years later we learn a lot of things. As you know from the reading, there were over 70 missiles and launchers and warheads there that we discovered. Actually, the truth of the matter is there were twice as many medium-range ballistic missiles. Another piece of this that really didn't have much play in the decision-making except at the level of the players, and that was the presence of some light bombers, IL-28s, that the Soviet Union also had placed in Cuba. Because if those could fly into the United States and remove some retaliatory capability at the same time as a strike, then we would really have had a degraded possibility of a response, and therefore you increase the risk that is there that someone might, in a miscalculation, take, because we have all of those casualties, and then our ability to respond is even degraded. So those planes become subject matter of the negotiations. Actually, we talk about 13 days in the movie, and the 13 days, 16 October to 28 October, but the fact of the matter is it goes all the way to the 20th of November until the last of the planes leaves Cuba and the last of the freighters with the missiles and launches leave. We also didn't know that there were 100 tactical nuclear weapons in the hands of the Soviet battalions that were there. And we learned later that the battalion commander had authority to use tactical nuclear weapons in the event of an invasion. That's incredible that we went through all of that decision making and didn't know about the other 100 tactical nuclear weapons, and the fact that there was authorization without going back to Moscow for codes and commands for the commanders on the scene to use in the event of invasion. So, lots of false data, many more missiles there than we thought, the tactical nuclear weapons there, and also the fact that these missiles, the IRBMs, actually were mated up. Some things, of course, were unknowable, and we have to act with ambiguity and ambivalence. I understand that completely.